Imagine being told you can vote, but only if you can read, and then being kept from ever learning how. For millions of Americans in the South, that was not a riddle. It was the system. The right to vote was locked behind a reading test, and the key, the simple ability to read and write, had been held out of reach for generations. Then one school teacher decided to hand out the key. You have probably never heard her name. Some people change the world, and the world never learns their name. This is without whom. Her name was Septima Clark. She was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1898, the second of 8 children. Her father had been born a slave. Her mother, a fierce woman who had spent part of her childhood in Haiti, took in other people's laundry to feed the family. From the start, Septima understood 2 things. Her family had almost nothing, and learning was the one thing no one could take from her. When she passed her teaching exam, the city of Charleston would not hire her. Its public schools did not employ black teachers. So at 18, she crossed the water to John's Island, to a sagging wooden schoolhouse they hopefully called Promised Land. There she faced something staggering. More than 100 children of every age crowded into a single room, while nearby a school for white children held a handful of pupils and far more money. On that island, she made a discovery that shaped her whole life. The grown-ups came to her too. Fishermen and field hands and mothers who had never been allowed to learn, asking her quietly to teach them to read. She watched what reading did to a person, how it straightened their backs. And she began to understand that in the American South, reading was not just knowledge. Reading was power. Here is why it mattered. Across the southern states, a black citizen who tried to register to vote was handed a reading test. Recite a passage. Explain a line of the state constitution. Get it wrong in the eyes of a hostile clerk, and you were turned away. Whole counties where black families were the majority sent almost no black voters to the rolls. The test was never really about reading. It was a wall. For more than 30 years she taught, in country schools and city schools, studying further each summer under some of the finest black scholars in the country. She joined the nation's leading organization for black rights and helped win a lawsuit forcing her state to pay black teachers the same as white ones. She was building, without quite knowing it, toward a single idea. In the 1950s, she found a small, daring school high in the Tennessee mountains, one of the only places in the South where black and white people learned side by side. There she met people who believed, as she did, that ordinary folks could be taught to claim their rights. Her life's work finally caught fire. And there, just months before history turned, a quiet seamstress sat in one of her workshops. Her name was Rosa Parks. A few months later, that same soft-spoken woman refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and a movement was born. Septima never claimed any credit. But she understood what the cameras missed. Behind every brave act in the spotlight stood years of quiet preparation, in classrooms and church basements, where someone first taught a frightened person that they had the right to say no. In 1957, on her beloved John's Island, Septima opened the first of what she called a Citizenship School. The teacher she chose was not a teacher at all. It was her cousin, a beautician who had never stood before a class. That was the point. She did not want a professor lecturing down at people. She wanted one of their own, sitting beside them, teaching them to read using the ordinary things of their lives. The lessons looked humble. Older students traced letters and read aloud from mail-order catalogs and their own Bibles. But what they were really learning was how to sign their names, how to read a ballot, and how to fill out the form that would let them register to vote. Women who had washed other people's clothes their whole lives walked out able to read, and many marched straight to the courthouse to register. The idea spread like fire across the Deep South. But power noticed. To the men who ran the segregated South, a black woman teaching thousands to read and to vote was more dangerous than any single speech. Because a speech ends. But a person who can read and who knows their rights does not forget. And so the machinery of the state turned toward her. South Carolina passed a law forbidding any city or state worker from belonging to a civil rights group. She was ordered to quit the organization fighting for her own people. She refused. And so, after 40 years in the classroom, she was fired, and the state stripped away the pension she had earned. They tried to erase her. They did not understand who they were dealing with. Losing her job did not stop Septima Clark. It freed her. The mountain school hired her full-time, and she poured everything into the Citizenship Schools. When the state shut that school down too, the movement simply picked the work up. The young minister now leading the great marches took her program into his own organization. By the middle of the 1960s, Septima was crisscrossing the South, training an army of teachers who fanned out into tens of thousands of homes. Her citizenship schools reached an estimated 25,000 people and helped put roughly twice that many new names onto the voting rolls. When the nation finally passed its great voting rights law, it landed on ground she had spent years quietly plowing. The foot soldiers of the movement had learned to read at her tables, and yet, inside the very movement she helped build, she was pushed to the edges. The famous photographs are full of men at microphones. Septima sat on the governing board, but she later said plainly that most of the men there did not think a woman belonged in the room. Her ideas were praised, then quietly handed to others. Again and again, she was asked to step back into the shadows. So the world moved on without learning her name. The marchers she had prepared became famous. The leaders she had supported became legends, their words carved in stone. And Septima Clark, the schoolteacher who had armed a whole generation with the ability to read, faded into the background of a story she had helped to write. Think of the cruelty of it. A woman who had taught for 40 years, who had taught grown men and women to read their own names for the first time, was for years denied even the small pension she had earned. The state she served tried to leave her with nothing. But Septima Clark was not finished, and slowly the truth caught up with her. In 1975, the people of Charleston elected her to the very school board that had once cast her out. The next year, South Carolina admitted she had been wrongly fired and at last returned the pension it had taken. Late in her long life, a president of the United States stood before her and honored her for her service to the nation. She lived to see the grandchildren of her students vote freely, something the reading test had once made nearly impossible. She wrote down her story so it could not be lost again. When she died, in 1987, back home near the island where it all began, the leaders of the movement called her what they had always known her to be, the mother of the movement. We remember the marches and the speeches, the soaring words and the famous faces, but none of it would have held together if the people in the crowd could not read the ballot they were fighting to cast. Behind the movement stood a school teacher who believed the simplest act in the world, teaching one person to read, was also the most revolutionary. The world you live in was built by people you have never heard of. And now, you know one more name: Septima Clark. Like and subscribe and stick around because the textbooks left a lot out. Thanks for watching.